We all feel it, the bite of the nostalgia bug, that little itch to revisit an aspect of our past that we feel shapes who we are today. And right now, my nostalgia bug bite is just itching for me to revisit EERIE, Indiana. A little gem from 1991 that predates the likes of The X-Files, Twin Peaks, and even Gravity Falls. Incidentally, EERIE, Indiana was part of the inspiration for Gravity Falls later in TV history. Basically, the series, not film, but series, centers around a young man named Marshall Teller. He lived in New Jersey, just across the river from Manhattan, a place that was crowded, polluted, full of crime. For him, it was heaven. But his parents knew that if he stayed in Jersey too long, he would end up like that freak Snooki. Just kidding, Snooki. I know you're not a freak. You're not interesting enough to be a freak. So the family moved to EERIE, Indiana. Mr. and Mrs. Teller, Sister Cindy, and Marshall. Quickly, Marshall met a young boy named Simon, and the two became fast friends, even though Marshall is a couple years older than him. But turns out EERIE isn't quite as wholesome and normal as Mr. and Mrs. Teller thought. It's, let's just say, EERIE is a fitting name, because as it turns out, EERIE is the center of weirdness for the entire planet, at least until Gravity Falls came into the picture. Yes, there was a tiny reference to EERIE, Indiana. If you look closely on one of the maps in an episode of Gravity Falls showing weirdness, there is a spot on Indiana which I think might be EERIE, but Gravity Falls is the one that takes the cake. EERIE is just noteworthy. But in this case, EERIE is the place. We begin with the story of Foreverwhere, a seemingly out of time homemaker and her sons try to sell this strange super Tupperware that's supposed to keep stuff fresh forever, so long as the vacuum seal on the lid stays tight, to Mrs. Teller, even sort of trying to indoctrinate her into her little group of ladies that seem to be from different time periods. Unfortunately, this little group is more trouble than they're worth, because, as it turns out, the homemaker lady seals herself and her sons up in giant Foreverwhere tubs in order to stay young forever, forcing her sons to stay as children rather than grow up, because losing her husband caused her to go insane. So she formed this little Foreverwhere cult, so these ladies and their kids could stay the way they are forever. Luckily, the kids enlist Marshall and Simon's help in breaking free of their mom's hold. So, after releasing the boys from their Tupperware tubes, they take care of their mom by breaking the vacuum seal on her Tupperware, which causes the aging process to accelerate, because there's sort of a ticking clock. If they could just stay out of the tubs or tubs for long enough, they'll reach their proper ages. And while the boys are finally happy now that they're able to enjoy the perks of adulthood, their mom, well, she wasn't so happy. She reacted like one would react to a slasher. But eventually, she developed senility, and that was the end of her. Although, they still live in EERIE, so who knows if they'll crop up again. and the cult is still out there. Next, we meet another one of Marshall and Simon's friends, a young boy who I'm going to call Metalhead because I forget his name. He had really big teeth, so he got a really big retainer. Unfortunately, the retainer was experimental, and it reacted in a similar fashion to the supposed story of Lucille Ball picking up radio waves in her teeth, which led to finding an underground enemy encampment in America. Only this time, it didn't pick up communist troops or something like that. It picked up the thoughts of dogs. And it turns out the dogs of Erie, Indiana are more vicious than they appear. They don't simply want to run free, they want a takeover, starting with the local pound. One of the dogs kills and eats the local dog catcher, and while investigating the area, the trio gets surrounded by some of the dogs that showed up earlier and were not very friendly. And the leader of the group, a little poodle, decides to go all French Revolution on them, forcing the boys to open all the cages and issuing demands like no more kibble, making the humans sleep outside, no more leashes, and no more neutering. They also want the retainer that is giving Metalhead his abilities. Unfortunately, it's stuck. So they chase him off into the night, and later Marshall meets a dog and tries to extend an olive branch, saying his retainer cannot pick up anything, only to discover the remains of Metalhead's retainer caught in the dog's teeth, indicating that that poor boy came to a bad end. Whether the dogs continued to plot now that they can't be heard, we'll never know. Next, we find that EERIE's banking system is starting to modernize, thanks to Mr. Teller, who developed an AI interface for an ATM. Only it seems to have a few bugs. When Simon gets personable with the AI system, it causes a glitch, making it think it's a person. And so to keep Simon being friendly, it keeps giving him more and more of the town's money, causing the whole town to become bankrupt, and turning Simon into kind of a sleazeball. But when Marshall reminds him that he's Simon's friend because he wants to be his friend, and everyone else wants to be his friend because of the money, Simon realizes that he's got to stop treating the machine like it's a person. So they give the money back, which the machine can't handle, and so it sort of glitches back into being a simple ATM, only it doesn't work right, and so they have to take it out. So it's back to old school banking for the people of Erie. Next, it seems Marshall's dad, who is a bit of an inventor, has developed a new type of banana oil, which not only is supposed to be edible, but could have industrial purposes. Unfortunately, he puts it in his briefcase, which he then misplaces in the fridge. But luckily, Marshall got it out of the fridge and put it on the counter, only for it to vanish like that. It literally disappeared. So, it's up to Marshall and Simon to locate the briefcase, because that banana oil research and some samples that were inside the briefcase are very important to Mr. Teller's job. Also, the briefcase itself was a gift from Mrs. Teller. So without it, not only could Mr. and Mrs. Teller end up breaking up, but Mr. Teller could lose his job. So eventually, they track down some guy dressed as a milkman, who's played by a very famous character actor, who's in everything from Gremlins to the first Terminator film, and who sadly passed away recently. You'll know him when you see him. I think his name is Richard. Anywho, they follow this guy, and that leads them to the Bureau of Lost, run by yet another character actor who's been in everything. He also played the grandpa in the movie Luck of the Irish, so look that up. And as it turns out, this guy keeps collecting things that are lost on purpose because he thinks the economy will suffer like it did during the stock market crash in the 20s. Or was it the 30s? Anyway, the so-called big one. And he's afraid it'll happen again if the Bureau doesn't keep causing things to be lost. But after a bit of cajoling, the guy, while not returning the briefcase, does return a piece of a model that Marshall was working on earlier, only the last piece was missing. Turns out the pieces go missing in the Bureau before they leave the stores. Of course, this didn't go well with the higher-ups, so in order to appease Marshall and maybe get him to stop snooping, the guy gives back the briefcase. Only, turns out that wasn't necessary. Mrs. Teller gets Mr. Teller an even better new briefcase, and it turns out the banana oil research was a dead end. There was an industrial aftertaste that rendered the whole thing useless. So, despite being demoted, Marshall keeps the model piece, the guy keeps the the briefcase, and now the guy who was the original field agent is now in charge, and the formerly in charge guy is now the field agent. And so the Bureau of Lost keeps taking things. So keep an eye on your stuff, folks, because they're still out there. There's no room in that job for pity. Next is the Halloween episode. Marshall and Simon, dressed as George Bush Sr. and Gorbachev. Nope, scratch that. Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, who were very pivotal in the late 80s and early 90s, are preparing to go out for Halloween. Excuse me. And seeing as it's Erie, Indiana, they don't know what they're going to encounter. Unfortunately, Mrs. Teller has to pick up her husband, whose car broke down. And while they have a little intimate encounter, interrupted by pranksters on Halloween, and Cindy, the sister, who shows up here and there during each episode, she forces Marshall and Simon to babysit Simon's mischievous little brother, while she does her own thing. Unfortunately, things go awry when Marshall and Simon plug in a tape recorder to the TV to tape a cheesy mummy movie that they want to see later. And while the little brother is watching, he decides to chew on the remote control, which causes a power surge, and the boy is sucked into the movie. Meanwhile, the mummy gets pulled out and goes on a bit of a rampage, trying to get Simon and Marshall. Luckily, they knock him out and tie him up, and he's revealed to be an actor in the vein of Boris Karloff, played by Tony Jay, one of the prolific voice actors in the 90s. The other being Roscoe Jones, I believe his name is. They've done roles together on various things, from Spider-Man, the 90s series, to Treasure Planet. Anywho, basically, the old actor is tired of shambling around in mummy robes, or mummy wraps, and wants a vacation. But then he sees the little brat ruining his movie and wants to go back. So, after a bit of hijinks, they figure out that if he bites down on the remote as well, it'll switch everyone back. And so he does, just as the movie ends, and while Simon gets his little brother back, the mummy ends up in either a movie or commercial about surfing. So he finally gets his vacation. Next, we find that Marshall has a bit of a fear of the dentist. Actually, no, not the dentist. Getting an eye exam, because it seems that the new school nurse is doing very strange things, and when students enter her exam room, they don't come out the same. Furthermore, his eye exam is prompted by the fact that he's a bit of a prankster. Earlier in the story, he pranks his dad, and they team up to prank Mrs. Teller. Then all three of them team up to prank Cindy. Then later, Marshall and Simon end up getting some prank gum taken from them by a small-time school bully, and they nearly come to blows. Well, the bully almost clocks Simon and Marshall. But luckily, they're rescued by getting sent to the school nurse. Only she is some kind of communist, because she uses hypnosis to turn everyone into fun-hating zombies. She even turned some of the teachers and the principal into zombies. And the plan is to spread to the rest of EERIE. Luckily, before Marshall can get zapped by her machine, he gets a pair of special Groucho Marx glasses that get a laugh every time because they've been modeled after Groucho Marx himself. Frankly, I prefer a cheesy one-liner from the guy, or my preferred comedians, Abbott and Costello. Physical appearance doesn't really do it for me. Although working in Walmart, you can see some pretty colorful characters. But I digress. After Simon gets turned into a zombie, Marshall nearly follows him into the machine. Luckily, he can get a hold of the glasses and use them on the lady, who then gets stuck in her own machine, and Marshall and a now freed Simon hypnotize her into becoming a Joker of sorts, laughing all the way to the North Pole. And thankfully, the power of the glasses was able to break the curse on everybody else. Next, we see yet another early role of famous horror actress Danielle Harris. She plays a girl who needs a heart transplant and who catches the eye of Marshall and a young boy named Devin. Now, Devin's a bit of a daredevil. His philosophy is live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse. Unfortunately, after giving a very heartfelt present to Harris's character, his daredevil ways get him killed while he's skateboarding and gets hit by a truck. But in a masterful stroke of luck, Devin's heart is a perfect donor match for Harris's character. So, as Devin dies, Harris's character gets the heart. Only she starts to take on some of Devin's personalities. And when she and Marshall get close together, she starts to get this heart flutter, which prevents her from being herself. Eventually, she realizes, with the help of Marshall, that Devin's heart is jealous. So, she goes to Devin's grave and asks him to let her go. And in the end, she and Marshall share a heartfelt kiss. Devin tearfully lets her go, and while she and Marshall don't start a relationship because she needs time to be herself by herself, it's assumed that she sticks around and becomes her own person. Next, another tale of love lost, when Marshall and Simon find an old letter in an old book and meet a guy named Trip, played by Tobey Maguire, Spider-Man himself. Ironically, at this age, he could have played an accurately aged Spider-Man. But in this case, he's playing Trip, a ghost. Now, decades earlier, he fell in love with a girl named Mary Carter. Unfortunately, when he went to deliver a letter to her, because he was too chicken to actually talk to her, the idiot failed to look both ways while crossing the street and got hit by a car. And he couldn't cross the street once he died and became a ghost. But since Marshall found his letter, the curse can be broken by delivering that letter in person. Now, at first, Marshall and Simon think Trip is just some sort of otherworldly creature. And when Mary C. Carter answers the door, they think she's the recipient, but really it's Mary B. Carter, Mary C's aunt, who is in fact a cantankerous old bat who's been married multiple times, but since she was waiting for Trip to make a move, and he never did, he couldn't, she just became a bitter old crow. But luckily, eventually, they deliver the letter, and she lets them take her to a local all-in-one shopping place called World of Stuff, where she and Trip's ghost finally see each other. And finally getting to know the boy she pined for all those decades, she's finally able to let go of life. She passes away, and their ghosts go on to whatever's next to be happy in the afterlife. And also, Trip nudges Marshall in the right direction when he's reluctant to talk to a girl himself. It seems his character is kind of painted as a ladies' man, at least early on in the series. Next, we meet Sarah Bob, whose brothers and father, who all have the name Bob in their name, are all just really awful people. They give the Savages of Deliverance a bad name. And they treat Sarah like the personal housemaid. Meanwhile, Sarah dreams about her mom, who she doesn't remember, as having traveled to Paris. She's also a pretty talented artist, able to draw Marshall's lost bike, and even improving on the design. But things turn weird when an old Erie, Indiana pencil from World of Stuff gets used as a replacement for the pencil she was using when one of her brothers takes it. And when she signs her name on her artwork, it comes to life. But destroying the artwork wipes the thing from existence, or at the very least, crossing out her name wipes the thing from existence. So, at first she tries to reinvent her family as perfect, putting her real family in a fish tank. Then, she ends up giving Marshall a second bike for a while, and even giving Marshall and Simon a mural on his garage door of the two of them on a motorcycle, much to the chagrin of Mr. and Mrs. Teller. Eventually, Marshall and Simon are able to convince her to stand up to her family, who could care less. Then, when she draws Marshall's mom as her mom, just to feel something other than worthless, it's up to Marshall to convince her to find her own path and maybe look for her own mom. Which she does, and eventually she sends herself to Paris to be with her mom. And later, she sends Simon and Marshall a gift, a drawing of a new maid for her old family. One who's basically a drill instructor who whips them all into shape. Almost literally. Next, Marshall has to deal with the fact that Indiana does not have a daylight savings time. Deciding to be a little bit petulant, he decides to set his watch back 1 hour like he would normally do, because he was into something, and because no daylight savings time, he can't have that hour back, and he has to go to bed. But unfortunately, when you try to do daylight savings in Erie, Indiana, you end up in a time warp where you exist, but everyone else doesn't exist. And there are these creepy garbage men that if they get their hands on you, you're toast. Luckily, he meets an old milkman who's supposedly over 100, and who enlists his help in getting this other kid, a girl played by Nikki Cox, who has done several things. Most notably, played the daughter in a series which co-starred with Joe Bob Briggs, I believe, and Bobcat Goldwyn. Goldwyn? The guy with the weird voice. Anyway. The milkman convinces Marshall to convince the girl that, despite having disassociated with her isolation, thinking that it's great, she really should get home. Unfortunately, while she can successfully get home using her watch, setting it forward at the exact time and the exact place where she first did it, Marshall left his watch at home, so he's got to use the back of the milkman's truck, which is a window into milk cartons, where missing kids were usually pictured, to communicate with Simon in order to get him to set the watch forward. And he's got to dodge garbage men and get back to his bedroom, or else he'll have to spend an entire year in that time warp. Luckily, he makes it just in time, and before he leaves, he finds out that the milkman is actually him in the future. So the wibbly wobbly timey-wimey possibilities were endless with this episode. Next, we meet a professor of the weird. He's sort of like this mentor for Marshall, in that he explores possibilities that people often ignore. Unfortunately, we learn he's a charlatan. He makes a false prediction, transferring hands, that a UFO is going to crash land in Erie, but his assistant, while setting up the fake UFO, meets Bigfoot, who likes to eat out of Marshall's garbage, and for some reason has a bow on his head. And so things go off when, working together, Marshall and Simon and the fake professor discover a real UFO that landed in Erie, and not the fake one that the assistant planted. Eventually, the mayor, who is a bit of a criminal, tries to swindle the professor out of the UFO, but he's not budging. And eventually, it's realized that the UFO is real, and it takes off in full view of Marshall, Simon, and the professor, but the pictures that Simon tries to get are blurry. Furthermore, we get a little more insight into some of the characters in Erie. Like this one guy who looks like an Elvis impersonator, but who might actually be Elvis. Sometimes he's helpful, sometimes he's not. And he calls Marshall Little Paper Boy. Next, we get a bit of a natural disaster. It seems that a tornado that the town has dubbed Old Bob regularly bypasses Erie and buzzes the local trailer park, and doesn't take out Erie because because the town appeases the supposedly sapient tornado with a picnic. Only Marshall doesn't go. He doesn't like tornadoes ever since he saw the movie Twister. Or was it Twister? No, it was the Wizard of Oz. Because Twister hadn't come out yet. Anyway, he stays home, and that apparently makes Bob angry. Also, Bob dumps out a capsule containing a storm chaser by the name of, or played by, I should say, Matt Frewer. Yep. This guy's been in everything. From Star Trek to, well, everything, basically. He plays a storm chaser who believes that whirlwinds, like tornadoes, are alive. And he's got this device which supposedly picks up the voice of Bob. And it's been trying to speak to Marshall. Furthermore, this guy is kind of an Ahab-like character because Bob apparently killed his fellow storm chasers once. So maybe he's got some survivor's guilt, PTSD, whatever. So, in order to get Bob to pull him back into the storm eye in a new capsule because the old one was destroyed. Basically, he insults Bob in his own language. So, they confiscate a trailer that was going to be a door prize for the picnic. And the Storm Chaser believes that if he can get the new capsule into Bob's eye, he can direct Bob to Lake Erie to dissipate him for another year. And Marshall risks life and limb to get the guy to the trailer capsule thing and get his device back to him. And this cures his phobia of tornadoes. Next, we have a ghost story. One of my personal favorites of this show. There's a legend, see, about a bank robber by the name of Grungy Bill. Unfortunately, he's very inept. He tried to rob the Bank of Erie 12 times, and on the 13th time, he forgot his gun. So, a posse chased Bill to the town's old mill and Swiss cheesed it, and him, with bullets. Supposedly, Bill's still looking for his gun. Marshall and Simon visit the mill, still riddled with bullet holes, to try and solve the mystery. Only some fake scares have been rigged up to keep people away. Sparks from an old car battery, a breakaway chair on a pulley, a Halloween mask propped up by strings, and a pipe that when you talk into it makes your voice sound creepy. And the one who set this all up was some weird kid with gray Albert Einstein-like hair who later calls himself Dash X because he's got a plus, or depending on how you look at it, an X symbol on one hand and a minus or dash symbol on his other hand. He's also pretending to be a tough guy, though frankly I don't see it. He reveals that he came to Erie with no memory of who he is or where he came from a few months ago, and he is the only other person in Erie who realizes just how freaky things are. And while he forces Marshall and Simon to destroy a video recording that caught him in the act, he accidentally stomps a hole in the floor of the mill, finding Bill's gun, who he calls Betsy. Now, at first, Marshall and Simon are upset because the guy starts pointing the gun at them. But Dash is like, big deal, it's rusted solid. Only he manages to cock the hammer and fire the thing. Turns out it was loaded all this time. And the smoke from the gun coalesces into Grungy Bill himself. And when he picks up the gun, he becomes solid again, and the gun looks factory new. He thanks the boys and then takes them hostage. He's decided to rob the Erie Bank for the 14th time, and this time he'll do it, because if he doesn't, he'll be doomed to wander between life and death for eternity, or until the old mill is demolished to make room for new houses or a mini mall. So he enlists Marshall's help, and he ties Dash and Simon up, and things don't go as planned. Simon and Dash manage to escape immediately and go to the bank, where Bill has forced Marshall to dress up as a Old West girl, complete with that head bonnet. And they try to give the bank teller a note saying this is a stick-up. Oh, incidentally, the bank teller is a recurring character who was running the World of Stuff and was always in a different disguise. Only he wasn't actually the owner of the place. The actual owner, played by John Astin, Sean Astin's father, who also played Gomez Addams for many years from the Addams family. That guy was tied up in the basement. Only he didn't press charges on this other guy because he was a heck of a salesman. So anyway, like I said, things don't go as planned. The bank teller and former owner of World of Stuff, he cannot get the letter opened properly. Meanwhile, Simon and Dash make it to the bank and cause a disturbance, which distracts Bill long enough for Dash to knock the gun out of his hand, which then turns to rust again. And just before Bill loses all physical ability, he says, "I'm not leaving without robbing this place." And he steals a toaster that would be free if you open an account, finally fulfilling his destiny. Eventually, they all meet back up at the old mill, and Dash reveals that he broke the gun apart, meaning Bill has no choice but to cross over. But thankfully, since he did manage to rob the bank, his spirit now possesses the toaster that he stole. And Dash, well, he disappears. Unfortunately, Simon and Marshall did not get any evidence except for the toaster itself. Whether Bill's still in there, who knows? Next, we find out that every 13 years, a young man is sent to look for the EERIE wolf. And due to various circumstances involving the crooked mayor, John Astin's character, and Dash X, Marshall gets chosen to look for the wolf. Because if he finds it, the town will get good luck and good harvest for another 13 years. Only the previous seekers of the wolf, they never seem to show back up. They apparently go to Spain, but it's kind of a cover-up. And in fact, the mayor knows that there's something weird going on, but he forcibly turns a blind eye. So he's complicit. But after a bit of cajoling from Marshall, Astin's character helps him figure things out. Because when he and the coordinator of the festival, Mr. Cheney, go out into the woods to look for the wolf, we find out that Mr. Cheney, the clue is in the name, is a werewolf, and he's been eating the previous winners of the lottery to choose a seeker for decades. He doesn't want to, he has to. And the werewolf makeup is actually pretty decent for early 90s TV. Marshall, Simon, and even Dash, I believe, were able to subdue the werewolf and knock it out with several blows to the head. It's a wonder they didn't kill the poor guy. But not before Marshall is scratched by the werewolf. So, Once the werewolf escapes his bonds, because eating in front of him makes him mad and making him angry gives him extra strength, kind of like the Hulk, but with a lot more fur. Aston's character shows up to finally put an end to the werewolf with a silver bullet. Funny thing is, you don't need that much silver to make a proper silver bullet. You just need a little bead soldered in place at the tip of the hollow point. But I digress. Silver bullet, one shot, gotta take out the wolf. After a bit of back and forth, trying to find the wolf and then trying to evade the wolf, Aston's character manages to shoot the wolf in the foot, which does not kill the wolf, but rather cures the wolf. Mr. Cheney's human again and has a severe limp, but now what to do with Marshall? Now, they could technically dig the bullet out of Mr. Cheney's foot, which may or may not revert him to wolf form, I don't know. Restore the bullet to shootable condition, which can be done, and then shoot Marshall in the foot, but instead, Aston's character gives him a concoction that manages to cure him. At worst, he gets some mutton chops on his face during the next full moon. So, there's that. Next, we meet a beggar who babbles about the song My Sharona and having the knack, which is a reference to an 8-track tape with My Sharona on it. Basically, 8-track tapes were the precursor to slightly more modern cassette tapes, which in turn were precursors to CDs, which themselves were precursors to music downloads. Unfortunately, the beggar is the beggar is pursued by some kind of lady Terminator who even says I'll be back at one point, and has a gun that fires lightning. Yeah. It's the ultimate taser. Marshall and Simon, feeling sorry for the poor guy, decide to take him home, clean him up, and try to help him. They discover that all the junk in his shopping cart fits together and forms some kind of machine. And when the 8-track tape The Knack, which was among the various items, is plugged into the device, it zaps something into Simon, namely the brain of the beggar, who's actually a genius who developed a brain swapping device. But when he found out his wife wanted to use the device for monetary gain, namely rigging an election, he scrambled his own brain, destroyed the device, and has been running ever since. Unfortunately, his ex-wife, with the help of Dash X, who is only loyal to money, they catch up to Simon, Marshall, and the former beggar turned professor. And Dash threatens to destroy Simon's mind, which is still on the 8-track. And then the ex-wife shows up and reveals that she plans to rig a re-election. But then the machine has a short circuit, goes haywire, and everyone gets zapped. And now Marshall is in the body of the ex-wife and vice versa. Simon is in the body of the professor and vice versa. And Dash X, having a change of heart because of a little cajoling by Marshall, he's really good at cajoling, he decides to zap the ex-wife so everyone can go back to the way they were. Only, who does he zap? But then the ex-wife in Marshall's body, gives herself away, promising a lot of cash to Dash. But Dash realizes that Marshall doesn't have that kind of money, and so zaps Marshall's body, saving the day. Eventually, the machine is destroyed again, and the professor and his ex-wife decide to reconcile, and it's revealed that some fortune cookies that were opened earlier in the episode have all come true. And one more mystery of EERIE is laid to rest. Next, we find out that EERIE has its own moose lodge, only it's called the Loyal Order of Corn, where these guys devoted to corn, since technically they are in the areas that are famous for corn production, are building something. And Marshall is concerned because his dad has just joined the Order of the Corn, and he's worried it's a cult, much like the Forever Aware cult. Incidentally, one of the Forever Aware ladies and her daughter were in the bank when Grudgy Bill showed up. So yeah, they're still around. But anyway, he bribes Dash X, who finally has given himself that name, and gotten a job as butler. Learning from the current butler, who's been there a long time and is played by a very famous character actor who played the original Uncle Martin in the series My Favorite Martian, and who came back for the sequel movie to finish his story. Anyway, it's revealed that the Loyal Order of Corn has been building this transporter device which takes the form of a giant TV, only it needs a proper remote. Turns out, this guy, who has a Dash and an X on his hands, and who may or may not be related to our Dash X, is a space alien. He ended up transporting himself to Siberia in 1901, and he's been subtly influencing humanity to make first radio, then television, in order to rebuild the device that originally transported him so he can get home. Now, Dash, having had enough of a lack of a backstory, decides, I'm going to go in his place. But the guy says, no, he can't. And he's very cryptic. Personally, I think he's Dash X from the future, since the device that transported him originally is powered by tachyons, and those can make time go wibbly wobbly. So you never know. Maybe he landed in EERIE originally, and then he got older, found a way back. Then he somehow, in the far future, came back to Earth, but was too far back in time, so he had to invent TV and radio. But who knows? After a bit of a mishap with Marshall's mom, who puts on one of the special hats that makes the Loyal Order of the Corn function, and a brief interlude where Simon gets transported to another planet. Eventually, the device gets functioning properly, and the old man goes home, leaving Dash X with more questions. Next, we find the World of Stuff and its proprietor, once again played by John Astin, is in dire straits. The IRS have coming to audit him, and let's just say he hasn't been paying attention to his taxes. But then, some sleazy guy promising a fortune and selling out his entire store in less than a couple of days. And yes, played by Renee Auberjonois, better known as Odo from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He gets Aston's character to sign a contract, so the guy gets to work with advertising, even recruiting Dash X and getting him to sign a contract. The whole contract idea is sort of a running theme. So, Renee's character and Dash start doing commercials which cause people to fall asleep, and while they're asleep, they obsessively shop at World of Stuff. And Simon and Marshall manage to keep each other awake long enough to avoid falling asleep and becoming shopper zombies, right up until morning, when they both end up buying the last two items in the store, one of which is a special disguise kit that Marshall wanted to keep and had his mom get on credit, but fortunately he couldn't keep because he couldn't pony up the dough. And having gotten the whole town to sign contracts for credit to buy that stuff, he then reveals that the contracts, they fork over the signer's soul to someone or something. Apparently, this guy's a demon, and he's been making Faustian deals. Yeah. So, he then calls the contract up for payment and starts herding people onto buses that are said to be going to the mall, but at the last second, one of the signs on the bus switches from the word mall to another word that has 4 letters and 2 L's at the end. Hint, hint, it ain't no mall. At least not the kind you want to visit. But at the last second, as if it were divine intervention, the IRS agent shows up and insists on confiscating all the contracts to perform the audit. Unfortunately, the demon needed those contracts, and so having failed in his mission, gets pulled back to his point of origin, and I bet you can guess where that is. The curse is broken, and everyone is okay. Although, funny enough, Aston's character never gets the audit. At least not on camera. And he realizes that before you sign something, always read the fine print. Next, the show takes a bit of a turn into a mirror. When Marshall decides he doesn't want to go to a horror movie marathon with his family and friend, he just wants to stay home for some reason, that comes back to bite him in the butt as he discovers a script for an episode of EERIE, Indiana, where Dash X, apparently, while taking aim at Bigfoot, accidentally kills Marshall. And this transports Marshall, aka Omri Katz, the actor playing Marshall, to our reality, where his family and friend are actually just kind of lame actors. The mom is kind of a hussy, The dad is a prima donna. The daughter is trying to be a serious actress. And Simon's actor is a total sleazeball. He's like a mini Weinstein. Well, maybe not that bad, but close. Meanwhile, Dash X has decided to follow through on the Kill Marshall plot. And apparently that will, I don't know, gain him extra power, or maybe he'll take over the show. And it's up to Marshall, who's still Marshall, not Omri, and Mr. Radford, John Astin's character, who still has his own mind about him, to figure out a way to get out of this whole death plot. So what happens is Marshall goes around to various sets and backlots to try and figure out what to do after observing the various characters in their element. Then he hits upon an idea. Go to the writer's room after causing a diversion and type up a new ending for the episode. Luckily, he manages to get the episode rewrite into everyone's hands just in time. And so, getting back to his reality, he changes his mind and goes with his family. Meanwhile, Dash X says, "I was so close," before tearing up the script. It's a bit of a nod to how complex and hectic it is being an actor, and how you never know just who a person is when they're not acting. And then we come to, sadly, the series finale of EERIE, Indiana. They only made 19 episodes, but I'll get to that later. Marshall's other friend, Todd, is going through a rough patch. His dad lost the family farm and hasn't been able to bounce back, and he's taking his frustrations out on the poor boy, calling him an idiot, saying that the music he's listening to is rotting his brain. Meanwhile, Marshall, in order to sort of help him find a way to cope, gives him a death metal record, which has a deleterious effect on the boy. It causes him to be more rebellious, to dress more like a punk, and to yell the song's lyrics at his parents. He even tries to steal a milk truck, to go to another city to see the band play live. And Marshall nearly gets killed when the milk truck crashes. Meanwhile, Cindy has found her passion as an investigative journalist, riding around in police vehicles, reporting on crimes. There was a kerfuffle at a bingo parlor, and later she was present at the scene of the crashed milk truck. Meanwhile, the dad is convinced that there are secret messages in the record that his son listens to. So he plays the record backwards, and as it turns out, it's all the horrible things he's been saying to his son. Realizing what a negative effect he's been having on the boy, he and his son reconcile, and even brings a police officer who normally remains stoic to tears. In the end, Cindy decides maybe following police officers around to be an investigative journalist is not such a hot idea. What is a hot idea is following around firefighters. They're the real heroes, much to the chagrin of Mr. and Mrs. Teller. Meanwhile, Marshall decides to check his record to see if there are any messages imprinted on the vinyl. And when he plays the record backwards, he hears a song that Simon's been singing throughout the film, or throughout the story. some sappy number. Only it was just Simon messing with Marshall. And that was the end of Erie, Indiana. The show ran from 91 to 93, on and off. But because it was just too new and the people weren't ready for it, the show never got past 19 episodes. It was syndicated later in 97 and earned a cult following. And eventually, there was enough interest sparked to do a spin-off, Erie, Indiana, The Other Dimension. But we'll get to that next time. Till now, this is Mr. J signing out and reminding you, sometimes the mundane is anything but. Look closely at your friends, neighbors, neighborhood, and city, because you never know what weirdness lies just beneath the surface. And never trust a crow, especially one with a passion for eyeballs.